All right, so just to reiterate, my name is Lisa Rotz, and welcome to our webinar today. And before we begin, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge that the University of Alberta, including Kinsella and Matthias ranches, are located on Treaty 6 and 7 territory. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continue to enrich our lives today. So I'd also like to say a very big thank you to Alex for being our first webinar presenter. Alex is, she grew up in Lac du Bonnet. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly.
You don't need to pronounce it the French way, nobody does. Lac du Bonnet.
Lac du Bonnet in a small farming community in Manitoba. And she is working towards her Master's of Science at the University of Alberta, supervised by Dr. Edward Berg and Dr. Carolyn Fitzsimmons, where she's researching virtual fencing, which is what we're going to be chatting about today. And obviously an exciting new technology. So Alex at Education focuses on rangeland resources, beef production, and precision agriculture. And as you'll tell from her presentation, she's very enthusiastic and passionate about agriculture. And so I am going to let Alex take it away. But before I do, quickly, everyone is on mute, and we will save questions for the end. You can either type them into chat and I'll moderate questions, or if you use the function to raise your hand, I will go through and allow you to unmute and you can ask a question at the very end. So thank you so much for joining us again today. And I'll let you take it away, Alex.
Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon or even good morning, everybody. I'm not sure maybe where across the time zones you might be located. Thanks for the introduction, Lisa. My name is Alex. I grew up in and around beef production and farming in general, and made my way to Alberta, where I was lucky enough to start working for Edward and Carolyn, studying virtual fencing. So today I will be sharing with you what I did this summer in terms of a trial for virtual fencing for grazing cattle, and the results from that trial and the main lessons that I learned, which there were many of them. So, so we're all on the same page, but I'm sure everybody in this Zoom chat knows even better than I. General conventional grazing is usually done with permanent fencing. So whether it's barbed wire fencing or permanent electrical fencing, any sort of rotational grazing or movement of animals is often done with temporary fences, temporary electric fences that are moved anywhere from every 12 hours to every week. I was talking just a few minutes ago, one of the people on call today is actually moving their temporary fences right now. So big job. Hopefully the weather's not too bad where you are. And so obviously there are some real disadvantages to the current conventional system in terms of the labor that is needed to set up and maintain permanent fencing, and the labor that's needed to move temporary fencing for rotations, the cost of setting up and maintaining fences and fixing and replacing, and then also just the inconsistency of your ability to monitor your cattle. You only have so much time to have eyes on your cattle. And other than that, they could really be getting up to God knows what, you know? So basically, I am investigating virtual fencing, a particular brand of virtual fencing from No Fence, as a possible alternative to conventional fencing, or an additional tool that farmers may be able to use when they're producing beef. So what is virtual fencing? I'll give you an overview of what is virtual fencing, a bit of an overview of this particular system, and then I will introduce you to the study I did this summer, and then take you through some of the really interesting results and point out some of the lessons that I learned. So virtual fencing, it's a system it's a wearable system that in this case is a collar that goes on the animals that uses GPS to track their location and keep them in a specific area, a virtual pasture. So the system is made up of two parts. One is the physical collar that goes on the animal, and then the other part is the mobile application that goes on that you can find on your phone. This is what this particular kind of virtual fencing collar looks like. This is from a company called No Fence out of Norway. This is sort of the meat and potatoes of the whole contraption. There's two broad flat faces on either side. These are solar panels that charge the rechargeable battery. So the idea is that you can put the collars on once and then they should hopefully retain their battery throughout, as long as you want to keep them on the cattle for, you don't want to be switching out batteries. This also contains the GPS system, cellular network antenna, just everything that you would need to run the collar. These are the metal neck chains that go alongside an animal's neck, like right behind this heifer's ear, for example. And this is what conducts an electrical current for a shock when the animal gets, if and when the animal gets a shock. And then this is just the rubber neckband that holds everything together and keeps it from falling off the animal. The collars use GPS to remember the virtual fence boundaries and also track the animal's locations within those boundaries. You need an internet connection initially to set those boundaries for the collar, and then after that, the collar operates as a fence independently of the cell network. You do need internet in order to be able to get notifications or make modifications or rotate them. So any communication that the app needs to have with the collar, you need an internet connection. However, once you get that fence boundary downloaded to the collars, they operate as a fence, as a virtual fence without internet. So how do the collars actually work though? How do they control behavior? So there's two parts to the system. One is the collars will emit an audio warning when they sense the animal is getting too close to a virtual fence boundary. And then if the animal ignores the audio warning, they will get an electric pulse. So training is necessary to teach the animals that they can avoid an electric pulse or like a shock by turning around and going back where they came from. And once you train your animals, they will very reliably avoid electric shocks by listening to audio warnings. If an animal ignores the audio warning and gets a shock, and then they continue to ignore the warning and they get another shock, and then they do it a third time and they get a third shock in a row, the animal is considered escaped. So they're outside of the virtual fence. They've been shocked 3 times. They're considered escaped. The collar goes into like a sleep mode and doesn't keep shocking the cow. And then once the animal turns around and rejoins the rest of the herd in the virtual pasture, the collar wakes up automatically and starts working like normal. So there's no human intervention needed if an animal escapes and then returns on their own. Hopefully you'll be able to hear them. I will say that this is a pretty high-pitched sound, so be warned. I'm going to show you a couple videos. They're very short, just showing during the training period, this is what the audio warning sounded like, and just a couple of different reactions to the electrical shock. Which, side note, I should know the actual voltage of the shock that's administered, but it's about about 1/5 to 1/6 the strength of a regular electrical fence shock. So it's not very intense. So don't know if you can hear that. That one was pretty short. It sounds a little bit better in the next video. and I can replay that one if need be. So watch the heifers. There's the warning going up and up. And there's the shock. So the first heifer didn't have a very big reaction. Those heifers were pretty flighty and had a much bigger reaction. But that's the sound of the audio warning and about how long it takes them to get a shock if they're ignoring the warning. Just a quick overview of what you can expect from this particular system's mobile app. So this is like the headquarters of where you manage your virtual fence and your cattle herds. You can have multiple herds, you can have multiple pastures. It's a really well-designed app. So some of the main features are you can create new pastures, like here on the left. It's very easy. You just tap the screen to put down a fence post, and you can drag and drop the fence posts to different areas. You can see all of your collars at once, and you can have them split up into different herds, different pastures. You can filter them so you can see like which ones are running out of battery. You can name the collars. So this light gray number here, that's the virtual fence collar serial number. And I just put in the ID tags for each of our animals. This is like you open up the mobile app and this is the first thing you see. So this is your status update. These animals are in a virtual pasture live being, constrained by the virtual fence system. So this blue rectangle, this blue shape here is the virtual fence. And it's a little hard to see on the Google map. I've got a better image coming later, but this is a physical fence line. This is one. This is another physical fence line down here, and then the physical fence extends that way. So the red and green and yellow areas are where the animals have been located over the last 24 hours. And each little white dot here is the current location of each animal. And then you get a little bit of historical data at your fingertips in the app as well. So this is an example where I went into this pasture and I wanted to see where all of the electrical shocks happened yesterday. And so you get this little heat map of where were the shocks happening. So that can let you know if you've got any problem areas. So that's a nifty little, it's a nice app. It's pretty user-friendly. In terms of potential benefits of virtual fencing, honestly, producers, you guys will be the experts in how virtual fencing can be used. You know your animals, you know your land, you know the problems you want to solve. So you guys will be figuring out most of the cool uses for this technology. Some of the obvious ones are knowing the real-time location of your livestock at the press of a button, being able to see exactly where they are and if any are doing bad things. Oops, go back. Another one is you're able to control cattle movements, for example, for rotational grazing without the added cost of installing and maintaining infrastructure like cross fencing. You're also able to exclude cattle from any area you would like. So for example, a wetland or a riparian zone, anything prone to erosion, anything that you just don't want to get trampled by cows right away. And of course, the big idea is that you'll be able to herd your cattle with less labor and remotely. So it would sure be nice in some of these sub-zero temperatures to stay inside sitting in your armchair and say, oh, it's time to move the animals and move the cows from your armchair in home. I think that's the dream. So ultimately, though, the potential uses are really going to be limited by your imagination. So what did I do this summer? I ran a trial at the Kinsella Research Ranch. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Kinsella, it's a university-owned commercial beef ranch. And it's located in the Aspen Parkland area, and it is more or less, it has some really rolling topography with some pretty big ups and downs. It has wetlands, it has bush, it has pasture, like a little bit of everything. This map on the right is the specific area where I was running my trial, but it's a much bigger place than just this. I ran 49 heifers and 2 bulls, so overall 51 head. They were the Kinsella composite breed, so just the mixed beef breed that comes out of Kinsella. Like I mentioned, there's a training period that's necessary for the cattle. So I did an 11-day training period to teach them how to use the collars. I think that was excessively cautious, and I easily could have gotten away with like a 5-day training period, and even potentially less, although I think that needs to be investigated further. And then I did 2 months, 8 weeks of rotational grazing, where I moved them about once every 7 days. I used the virtual fence to, first of all, create pasture boundaries and create the virtual fences and pastures. I also used it to rotate the cattle just from one spot to another. I used it to herd them and move them for reasons that were not just rotation, and I'll get into that in a minute. There were some really cool examples of this, and also controlling water access. So this map here, all of these red lines are the physical barbed wire pasture lines that were already up. I focused my study in the northwest, northeast, and this new hill here in the southeast. And then this alleyway is an alley that leads down south to the handling facility, where the animals were brought in every 2 weeks for weighing and actually blood samples. And I took some forage samples as well, just to see how fast were they depleting the grass in the pastures. So this is what I did. I used this yellow line represents a virtual fence boundary, and I used virtual fencing to cut each one of these pastures in half. And so basically I started them in one of these little half pastures and excluded them from the other half, did that for a week, and then I rotated them over to the other half of the pasture, and then I rotated them up to this northeast and then northwest, and then they rotated up to this north and then the south field, and we did that for 8 rotations. So generally results were really positive. I can happily say that I successfully used the virtual fencing to maintain a rotational grazing system this summer. Something like it was 99, almost 100% of the time, 99.18% of the time, the animals were where they were supposed to be within the fence line. They weren't escaped. There were 2 kind of categories of escapes that happened. The first was when an individual heifer, or like maybe 2 or 3, would escape on their own. They would cross the boundary, and the rest of the herd would stay within the boundary and not be particularly bothered by this. And in these cases, the 1 or 2 or 3 heifers that escaped on their own, usually within 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes up to an hour, would just turn around and walk back to join their buddies on their own, and didn't require any intervention to get them back in where they were supposed to be. And really, I didn't see any like main escapees who were getting out of the pasture fence over and over again. It was usually different animals. The second escape the second type of escape that happened was a massive escape when a really severe thunderstorm rolled in, and they were on the side of the pasture that didn't have any trees or cover. So they all escaped en masse to the other side of the pasture that had some trees and some cover, weathered out the storm over there. And then the next morning, they all just walked back over to the other side of the pasture, and the virtual fence turned back on, and it all proceeded normally from there. I was able to herd the cattle with the virtual fence. All of the animals gained weight between the beginning and the end of the trial. And I'll show you the graph for this, but there wasn't any relationship that I could find with number of shocks. So, the animals who got really fat, there was no relationship to whether they had no shocks or less shocks. There was, which is good news, because we don't want to be giving them so many shocks that they lose weight. I can say that both bulls and heifers learned to avoid the electrical shocks. So that was a bit of a surprise to me and also really encouraging. We didn't lose a single collar throughout the almost 10 weeks total of experiment. We now know what the conception rate was, and it was 92% for the 49 heifers. That's not too bad. And the estimated forage use for each pasture was about 61%. So this is really interesting. This is where I got into a couple of unexpected situations with virtual fencing, but it worked really well. So the first one I'm going to talk about is when I used virtual fencing to herd the animals in a situation that was not related to rotations. So as I mentioned, every 2 weeks they would go down this alleyway to the handling facility to be weighed, and then they would be brought back up. And in this case, I was not on the farm. I was somewhere else, I think, giving a presentation. And the wrong gate was left open. So they were supposed to go back in here into the New Hill pasture for their new rotation. But instead, they went back into the northwest field, which is where they had just come out of. So no big deal. It happens. And me and my team, we thought this is a great opportunity to see if we can move them using the virtual fence rather than getting somebody in there with a quad and stirring them up and running them around, that sort of thing, and wasting the guy's time. So we used the virtual fence. If you follow my cursor here, we used the virtual fence to create like this L shape or like a curved shape of a pasture, because we needed them to go from this northwest field, head east through this black dot, which is a gate, into the northeast field, and then head south through a second gate into the New Hill where they were supposed to be. So we used the virtual fence to create this like curved, really big corridor. And then as the animals ended up naturally walking through that corridor, because they had nowhere else to go, they couldn't go up here, they couldn't go down here, and they couldn't head over to this water. So as the animals started walking along in the only direction that they could go, I was keeping an eye on them through the app and just like marching the back of the virtual pasture up behind them so that they couldn't turn around and go back where they came from. And I think it took maybe an hour or two, and I had a couple of research assistants just watching this happen. They weren't close enough to be pushing the animals or anything. They were just keeping an eye on them. And sure enough, within a couple hours, all of the animals had followed this corridor all the way down into the pasture where they were supposed to be. So no intervention required. I thought that was really cool because I did that. I wasn't even on site. I did that from miles away. So that was a really cool and unexpected application this summer. And then the other one that's nice is this northeast field here. As you can see, there's no water in it, which is a problem. So after they had finished their rotation here in the New Hill pasture and we moved them up north into the northeast field, I left this black gate, this black dot, which is a gate, I left that gate open. And when I set the virtual fence for their new rotation, I just skipped it down a little bit into the old pasture and included just the top half of the watering hole and just a path to get into the watering hole. And then that's it. And it worked like a charm. We didn't have any escapes into the rest of the New Hill pasture. All of the animals, they would come in here, they would filter through this gate, they'd go to water, then they would come out here and they would try to get into the rest of New Hill, and they'd run into the virtual fence. And so they very quickly learned to just come back up here into the northeast field. So that was really cool that I could control their access to water like that. No additional fencing required, thank goodness. Okay, so my results. I mentioned that I was able to use virtual fencing to successfully rotationally graze them. So one of the things that I used to look at that success is I wanted to compare the number of warnings they were getting throughout the trial to the number of electrical shocks they were getting, because I really needed to know that they were learning how to avoid electric shocks. So I wanted to see the number of shocks going down. So that's definitely what I saw. In this graph, the blue bars represent the total number of shocks that happened in each grazing period. And then the pink bars here at the bottom represent, sorry, did I say shocks? The blue bars are the total number of warnings, and the pink bars are the total number of electrical shocks that happened for each grazing period. And as you can see, the audio warnings are actually going up over the course of the trial. You can see that they're getting quite a few warnings, but the number of shocks is staying quite low and is actually going down. So in the next graph, you can see that a little more clearly. What this is this is a ratio of the number of electrical shocks divided by the number of audio warnings. I basically wanted to get a percentage of how much of the time were they getting shocked if they also, like, how much of the time were they getting shocked when they were getting audio warnings. So if they got a warning, what were the chances they were about to get a shock? So here in the training period, 33% of the time, if the animal heard a warning, they were also going to get an electrical shock. So 1 out of 3 warnings turned into a shock. In training period 4, which they're not always consistent number of days. I know that's confusing. Sorry about that. So training period 4 starts in June 28th. So 2 days after training period 3, the number of shocks they were getting was already cut in half to 18% of the time they were getting electrical shocks. It's pretty good. A couple days later, training period 5, starting in June 29th, they were down to 14% of the time they were getting electrical shocks. And then in the first experimental period, they got shocked about 10% of the time. Still pretty good. I would be happy with a number like 10%. However, for the rest of the grazing period, they got shocked around 3, 4, 5% of the time. So they were really learning to avoid those electric shocks, and they were really respecting the virtual fence boundary. An interesting pattern that I saw, which is not unexpected, but it is interesting, is that on day 1 of a rotation, when they had lots of grass to eat, lots of forage supply, there were fewer warnings than at the end of the rotation period, say on day 7, when they had eaten a lot of the forage, there wasn't that much grass, and they were just looking at the other half of the pasture, at all of that fresh, luscious grass that the virtual fence just wouldn't let them access. So this green line here, this is not any actual numbers. This just represents the fact that as the animals graze each day, the amount of forage goes down. So you can see that as the amount of forage goes down, this blue line again represents the number of warnings that happened each day. And on day 1 of the rotation, they got 500 warnings. And on day 7 of the rotation, or day 6 of the rotation, they got over triple the amount of warnings. They got over 1,500 warnings in 1 day. But if you look down here at the number of electrical shocks, there was almost no increase over the course of the week. You can see that there's like, it goes up, but then it goes down, and then up, and then down, and then up, and a little bit up. So even though they're interacting with the virtual fence as the grazing period goes on, and they're getting a bunch of warnings, they're not getting any more shocks. And that's really cool, because I think that they learned to listen to the audio warning and to use that to sort of navigate their environment, and almost use it like echolocation, where they would hear the audio warning, they would know how long they had before a shock, and then they would move on before they got a shock. And I think that shows that there was really good success in them learning the system. I mentioned that there's proof that both bulls and heifers learned to avoid electrical shocks, and this is the proof. So back here, I showed you a whole herd ratio of shocks to warnings, right? So They were receiving a higher shock to warning ratio up here and lower bit down here. So when you compare bulls and heifers, you can see that on average, the blue bars are the bulls and the pink bars are the heifers. On average, the bulls receive a higher number of shocks per warning. So they start up here at 30%, and then it drops down to just under 20%, and then, 10, 15%, and so on. And that the heifers consistently receive electrical shocks less often. However, you can see that both bulls and heifers have this downward trend where over time the bulls learn to get less electric shocks, and over time the heifers learn to get less electric shocks. So I did a little bit of other data analysis just to make sure that this is true, but I can pretty confidently say that both bulls and heifers learn to use the system. I mentioned that I didn't see any relationship between weight gain and number of electrical shocks, and I wanted to give you a little bit of proof for that. So on the left here, we have aggregate weight gain in kilograms. So that is the total weight gain or loss, but none of our animals lost weight. So this is the total weight gain over the summer from June 24th to August 30th. And down here is the total number of shocks that each animal got over the same period. And each of these dots represents one animal and the amount of weight they gained and the number of shocks they received. So this is basically, this line here is saying that if there was a relationship where as they got more shocks, maybe they gained less weight or maybe they started losing weight, this line would have showed that. So because this line is really straight across, and you can see that all of these animals, all of these dots are scattered across the graph, there is no relationship, or this was able to prove that there was no relationship between weight gain and electrical shocks. And what this means for you or for anybody who wants to start up using virtual fencing is that, as you know, if from what I'm seeing here in my data, you don't have to worry about shocks from the virtual fence system affecting your bottom line weight gain. So you obviously wouldn't want to use a system where, well, if that animal gets shocked too many times, they're going to start losing weight, because that's going to affect your bottom line, and that's going to affect your the money that you bring in, and that would just be useless. So good news is we don't see any evidence of that. This is a bit of an interesting one. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. This is just the behavior that I observed. So I want you to look at this like one group at a time. So this is the control group. So these animals had no collars. This is the no fence group. They had the no fence collars put on. And there's a separate study going on right now with a different type of collars called low tech. And I just included them because I thought it would be interesting to compare the behavior between two different collars. So a collar reaction score is a score that I gave to an animal on handling day as they were leaving the chute, because I wanted to assess how much did the collar bother them and how much did they react to having a collar dangling from their neck. Collar reaction score of 1 means that they didn't react to the collar. They could leave the chute with any speed, walking or running. I wasn't really scoring for that, but I was looking for head shaking and jumping and rubbing their head and really obviously freaking out about the collar. So collar reaction score of 1 means there was no reaction to the collar, couldn't care less. Reaction score of 2 was like a little bit of a reaction, minimal head shaking. They didn't really mind. Collar reaction score of 3 was a pretty moderate reaction. So you could tell that they noticed something was going on. They didn't like it, but it wasn't the end of the world. And then collar reaction score of 4 was those heifers or those animals where it's the end of the world. they're going to die if they don't get this collar off in the next few seconds. A really big reaction to having a collar around their neck. So for the control group, obviously none of them had collars, so none of them displayed like a collar reaction behavior. If they had been shaking their head or reacting, I definitely would have scored that, but I didn't see any head shaking. For the no fence group, over half of the group had a reaction score of 1. They couldn't care less. About 26% of the animals had a reaction score of 2, so they noticed, but it wasn't a big deal. About 9% of the group had a more moderate reaction where they did not like the collars, but they weren't flipping their lids. And then 6 to 7% of the animals really despised having the collars on, or it looked like they did. They were having a really big reaction. I did note anecdotally as I was doing these behavior observations that within 5 minutes, really within 2 minutes, but for sure by 5 minutes, even the animals that had this really extreme collar reaction had settled down and stopped worrying about their collar, and they were no longer shaking their heads or trying to rub it off or running around or jumping. And then the other collar group, the low tech group, they were 2/3 were collar reaction score 1 and 2/3 were collar reaction score 2. I think that's the more interesting of these two tables. I'll briefly talk about this one on the right. So this is just getting more into types of behaviors that I saw. I just want you to be able to look at these numbers and compare them. The numbers themselves don't mean like this happened a certain amount of time. It just makes you able to compare between groups and between behaviors. So the control group, we saw them doing, this is after the collars were put on. So the control group, we saw a little bit of head shaking, a little bit more head rubbing, very small amount of running and a very small amount of jumping. The no fence group, not surprisingly, we saw a lot of head shakes after the collars were put on, a little bit of rubbing and a little bit more running and jumping. And then this is what surprised me, that the low tech group, the other collar group, saw a lot more head shaking than even the no fence did. I think this is due to the design of the collar. The low tech collars are really bulky. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting. So I had mentioned that these collars are powered with a rechargeable battery that in and of itself has a pretty good battery life. However, they're expected that it's solar panels that will be maintaining the charge of the collar throughout however long you want to use it. And I don't know about you guys, but I am very skeptical of solar power and how reliable it actually is. I can happily say that I was pleasantly surprised both this summer and this winter by how the collars did. So this is a graph from this summer showing the average daily battery charge. So I will say that, when there's an average, that means that half of the collars did better and half of the collars did a little bit worse than whatever the average is. But it's a good way to see the general performance of the batteries. And so this up here is the second they were turned on for the very first time, and they'd never used a little bit of battery in their life. So they were turned on this day, and then you see a little bit of a decline. This is not the whole axis, by the way. This is only showing the top of it from 390 to 420 centivolts. If I showed you the whole graph, it would be very, very long. Basically, what this means, what I saw, this line right here represents a battery with about 95% or 92% charge. So over the course of the summer, the collars dropped down to about a 92% charge, and then they stayed there for 2 months. I was really, really pleased with this. All of the batteries stayed above 85% charged all summer. I couldn't have asked for a better battery performance. However, winter is another story. And even though you know, I was suspicious of the solar panels at first, and then the summer went really well, and I saw that the batteries performed really well, and I was like, you know, that's great. Love to see that, but I'm still really suspicious about whether the solar panels will work in an Alberta winter with the extreme cold, with the lack of light, and with the really weak sunlight that we do get. I'm really happy to say that the batteries performed almost as well in the winter as they did in the summer. So this winter, I was really lucky to be able to work with Dr. Obi Daruna at Lakeland College. He was doing a winter swath grazing trial, and he used 30 of our virtual fence collars as part of his trial. And he put the collars on November 30th, turned them on November 30th, and then he just took them off on January 20th. So the collars ran for almost 2 months over some of the coldest and darkest days of the year, right? And we can see that the collars on average, they kind of started to dip down. I'd say that this is probably about a 90% charge right here. And then whatever day this was, sort of in the first half of December, they got more light, so the collars charged back up. And then throughout the rest of December, there was a steady decline in collar battery until New Year's Eve. I would like to remind you, though, that this lowest point in collar battery life right here still represents a good 80% or 75% charge. This is not even close to being out of batteries. So the lowest peak that we hit was about, I'd say, 75% charged. And then after that big cold snap that we had, and we started getting some more sunlight, the batteries actually started regaining charge. They didn't just hold out here for the rest of winter. They recharged themselves and went back up to 80, 85, 90% charged. So super happy to see that. Really unexpected, but really, really glad. Oops, that was actually an old slide. So this is the same slide that I was talking about, actually just with a few more days, but sorry about that. I should have deleted that first slide. I've had a lot of really good things to say about virtual fencing and the no fence system so far, and I don't want to mislead you and pretend that there's no problems. So we have had a few problems. The first one that became pretty clear to us is that while virtual fencing works to control your cattle, it doesn't do anything for neighboring cattle who might have escaped their physical fence and want to come check out your interesting animals. So we did have 1 week over the summer where some neighboring cattle broke out and came to visit my animals, and we had to get them separated, and it was totally fine. Just a normal case of separating some animals that didn't belong together. But yeah, your virtual fencing will not control somebody else's animals. If you're using the virtual fence to create like an alleyway or even an oddly shaped pasture, you have to be careful, because narrow areas, narrow alleyways, and really sharp corners will confuse your animals. So actually, yeah, I'll go back real quick. So this was one of the pastures that I created, right? And you can see here, rather than just pulling this out and then making a right angle over to the water, I designed this with a curve that would kind of buffer animals, because if they're using an audio system to find out where a boundary is and they walk into a sharp corner, they can start getting, sort of shocks from different areas, and they can start getting really confused by that. So that's really important to keep in mind. There was we didn't really see this as an issue too much, but I was told about it from somebody else who was using the no fence collars, where if you have a really small paddock that's like, say, 1 acre or less, there is an issue where the GPS isn't always perfectly precise. And so in a small paddock, if the GPS isn't precise, sometimes an animal can get an electric shock even though they're already inside the pasture. I didn't see this problem because they have a lot of room to move around. So if there's a GPS drift problem and the animal starts getting an audio warning, even though they're already inside the pasture, they've got a lot of room to like turn around and run away from that audio warning and avoid a shock. So my pastures were about 10 acres each. I didn't have to worry about that, but 1 acre or less, I think it becomes a bit of a problem. We did have some issues with moisture and dirt leaking into the collars. Nothing, like we didn't have any electrical problems at all. This is more of a preemptive worry. So we're going to be keeping our eye on that this next summer. And then the cellular connection was it's pretty good at Kinsella, but there were some spotty areas where, you know, at the top of the hill, you've got 5 bars of 5G connection, and then you walk 2 feet away or 2 feet into the bottom of a hill and you've got nothing. So we had some issues with that. You need the cell connection to change pastures, to download data, to receive notifications. But we were able to find workarounds, and we're going to be looking more into like cell phone boosters maybe this coming summer as well. So the key takeaways for me were that virtual fence capabilities are a really promising alternative to physical cross fencing, or at least the technology looks really promising as a new tool that Alberta ranchers might be able to put into their toolbox soon. The no fence, this specific brand, the no fence collars, their battery life was great through Alberta summers and Alberta winters, which was a big surprise. We did experience some escapes, like I mentioned, with individual cattle and even the whole herd of cattle escaping at one point. But those animals returned. As long as they weren't like physically prevented from returning, they'd always return to the herd. That being said, if your animals are located near an urban center, near a highway, near a city, anything like that, I still strongly recommend or would say that a perimeter physical fence is still necessary, even just around your property. In the event that an animal does escape or something does go wrong, you have that last line of defense between your animals and the highway, the city, other animals, other people, etc. And it prevents other people's animals from getting onto your property, like I mentioned. The number of electrical shocks didn't seem to affect weight gain or conception rate. There was only 3 heifers that didn't catch this summer, and one of them received 20 shocks over the whole year. One of them received 50 shocks over the whole year, and one of them received 200 shocks over the whole year. So there was no real relationship between shocks and pregnancy. And the other thing I was watching out for was that the collars didn't cause any rubbing or chafing to the animals. No hair loss, no issues with bleeding or scratches or anything. They were heifers, and in the case of the Lakeland study, they were using them on young steers as well. So the collars did need to be adjusted occasionally as the animals grew. In my case, out of 49 heifers, I think maybe a third of them or half of them needed 1 collar adjustment over the course of the whole summer. And maybe 5 animals or less needed 2 collar adjustments to stay comfortable. But there's a lot of wiggle room, so you don't, I don't think in any case they were in danger of strangling or in danger of starting to get chafed raw, but we were bringing them in anyways for weighing, so we thought we might as well adjust their collars. Finally, before I open it up to questions, I'd like to say that none of this is possible without the people who fund our research. So in particular, this study is supported by the Smart Agriculture and Food Digitalization and Automation Program of Alberta Innovates. We're also supported by ARDAR and the Canadian Agricultural Partnership and the Alberta Beef Producers. So we thank them for their support. And I'm happy to take any questions now.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Alex, for presenting today. And I'm sure there's probably a few questions in the audience. You're welcome to type your question into chat, or if you want to give me an indication with that raised hand, we can take some questions. Just there's not so many of us, we couldn't do that. All right, we've got a question about the cost of the units. What's the cost per unit? And what's the response in rough terrain and shrubby terrain, riparian areas?
Yeah, so the collars, they're not available for commercial sale yet, so I don't know what their actual commercial price will be in Canada or in the US. For us, they charged us, I think it was $300 US per collar. And then they each came with a battery. And then it was another $60 US for extra batteries and for extra chargers. And then there's a fee per collar per year to be able to use like their software and their networks, and also to pay for the like the cell data that is used when you have to be on the internet. So there's a yearly fee or like a quarterly fee. I think they charge you for, cell data and that sort of thing.
Awesome.
I can go ahead through the comments, Lisa, if you like, because I've got them up.
Sure, sounds good.
And then also rough terrain and shrubby riparian areas. For most of my study, they were in pretty open areas, so I wasn't able to see a real response to shrubby riparian stuff. There was another August, September, there were two more, there was like another month and a half where 10 collars were left on a small group of animals just to test battery life. And they were in an extremely woody area. But they also weren't really being monitored that closely. So all I can say is that at the end of that trial with those 10 animals in a woody area, we still had every collar and none of the animals were injured or got injured. And that also the green strap on the back of the neck is designed to break away under the body weight of a cow or under half the body weight of a cow. I have to double check with the manufacturers, but it is designed so that if they get caught up, they can escape and not die. The next question, and just tell me if you want me to skip any of these questions, Lisa. The next question was, how long do batteries last if they never receive a solar charge? And it depends on whether they're sitting in a dark room doing nothing or whether they're being used. Obviously, the more a collar gets used, the faster the battery will degrade. And they almost always will have battery life or have solar charge if they're being used anyways. But I can say that having a collar sitting in a box doing nothing with no solar charge, the battery lasts at least a month, if not more. So at least 30 days with no solar charge doing nothing. Do you know if the rate of gain was different between virtual fencing and conventional fencing? That's a really good question. I know that there are other animals in these herds that we might have like sort of pre-summer and post-summer weights for. I didn't run an actual control herd because this was like a proof of concept year. So we will also be looking at running a control herd next year. But that's a great question. I want to compare that. I don't know that yet, but I will find out. Thanks for the question. With cow-calf pairs, do the calves need to be collared? And how do you think the collars would do in heavily treed areas? Worried about collars getting caught on tree branches? Yeah, so this year we ran them just on single heifers. This coming summer, we're hoping to run the collars on cow-calf pairs. That's the plan. We will not be collaring the calves. These collars are designed for adult animals. The company has collars for sheep and goats as well that are smaller. And they're also looking into developing a calf-specific collar. But for right now, we'll only be collaring the cows. And so we're going to see what happens when cows with virtual fence collars have calves that basically have free run. So that'll be interesting. And I think I addressed the heavily treed areas in that we didn't see any damage to the collars or the cows in the 10 that were left in a heavily treed area, and the collar does have a breakaway function. What do you think total lifespan of a collar is if worn all year versus worn for the one summer? That is a really good question. I tend to be suspicious and pessimistic of technology. So I have already been proven wrong by this company a couple times in terms of my expectations of their longevity and the way that the collars work. I was encouraged to see that over the winter with 30 collars, with steers like banging them around and wearing them and being brought in. And those steers were also brought in for weighing every 2 weeks. So we were quite worried about winter plus plastic often equals breakage, but we didn't see any breakage. Some of the collars or most of the collars after being used have some pretty deep scratches in them, but that has not affected their performance either in terms of the solar panels or as virtual fence collars. So, and the company told me that is normal and to expect that. So it's hard to say. I expect that if you have a collar on all year round, you would expect to lose some of them, either just from falling off or the strap getting caught or maybe through breakage. But I'm cautiously optimistic about the fact that you might get several. You would hopefully get, to be economical, you would expect to get several years, if not more, of use out of each individual collar, right? So I think that'll be a question for the company too, about like what their warranty is like, what they're willing to guarantee, that sort of thing. Lifespan replacement rate for a herd would be very interesting to track for the maintenance cost of the system. Yeah, that is going to be a huge variable in terms of whether people choose to use the system or not, or whether it's economical to implement this system. We're only using them for, a few months at a time right now. And we will be tracking if any of them break or how many, like we'll be tracking like the failure rate of them essentially. We're lucky enough that out of 50 collars, we haven't had any failures yet, but it's a good idea to track those sorts of things long term for sure. And I think that'll also come in if producers start putting that into their own operations. And then, they will know how long their collars last under which circumstances too. So it'll be really important, I think, to share that kind of information and experience. Do you know when it'll be commercially available? No Fence is currently rolling out in the US and in Spain right now. They are hoping to be selling commercially. I think but like definitely by the end of the year. And then they said Canada's the next step after that. So not this year, I don't think. Maybe next year. I would love that. They're really happy to work with producers and to work with people to have like demonstration herds and stuff. I know that they're having a hard time just physically making enough collars to meet demand right now, especially with some of the supply chain issues we've all been dealing with for the last 2 years. But I do recommend, if you're interested, getting in touch with them and putting your name down, because at least that way they know that there's maybe interest in Canada, right? So
where are they based? Where's No Fence based out of, Alex?
Denmark. So they're based out of Denmark. Currently, they don't have any like warehouses in North America, but they're setting one up for the States. So hopefully that will also solve some supply chain issues where we had a problem where they were trying to send us collars directly from Denmark. And then of course, shipping companies, it took a long time to get here. There were delays. So having like a locally sourced warehouse would make things a lot easier as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It looks like, we've got another question by Noreen.
Yeah, so the question in the comments is, you mentioned cellular need for moves, but not for warnings or shocks once downloaded. So could you use this for larger non-cellular areas without moves? Yes, that's the intention, that once you've downloaded the information, you don't need internet to have it work as a virtual fence. The only caveat being, without internet, you don't have that real-time monitoring of your animals. You don't, obviously you won't be able to move them. And you won't be able to just like open up your app and say, where is every animal? And I think it would also be a little bit harder to recover any lost collars or any, you know, dead animals if you have any that die over the year. So one of the nice things about the app and the internet is that if you lose a collar or if one of your animals dies, it'll let you know, and it'll let you know what the location is. So yes, you can use them in no internet areas. You just have to be aware that the capabilities would be a little bit reduced, and obviously you're taking on a certain amount of risk in terms of animal life and losing collars. But yeah, I don't see a problem in using them in areas with no internet. Yeah, good questions. These are really good questions. Thanks for asking questions. It certainly makes me feel really good after doing a presentation that, yay, I gave them something that was interesting and worth listening to. So.
And you have another year of research ahead of you. So
yeah, I'm really excited to do like round 2 or lessons learned part 2 with the further year of data, especially with the cow-calf data. I think that's going to be really interesting.
Awesome. All right.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, excellent. Really nice comments in the chat. Thank you.
All right. Well, probably lots of people have to go back to work, so we won't take up more of your time. If you want to forward the presentation, we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel and then uploading that to the website for SRM. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Lisa, for organizing this. You and the range management group, thank you for putting this on and for inviting me to speak for you. It was a great opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Have